Welcome back to MediaScience MYTH BUSTING. I'm your host, Philip Lomax, and I'm joined by Dr. Dwayne Varan. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing an important topic, which is brand safety. And certainly this is of interest to the broad media universe because in our industry, we produce a lot of content. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to be focused on television advertising. So today's myth is that advertisers shouldn't invest in contexts that are unsafe. So Dr. Varan, how do we tackle this myth?
I'm so glad you're asking this, Philip, because this was a topic that was very near our heart at MediaScience. You know, we talked in episode 2 of Myth Busting about this myth about news not being suitable for advertising. And we busted that myth, and we showed that in actual fact, on occasion, it's actually a superior environment. So, you know, the question is, could brand safety be in a similar schema? Could there be environments in brand safety that are being unfairly penalized? So it was a topic that was interesting to us, certainly something that we were curious about. But we had the good fortune of being approached by Warner Brothers Discovery. And they said, look, this is also a topic that we're interested in. Can you guys please help us? And of course, we were thrilled to do it. So we went about doing this task of trying to understand what effect content had when it was in that kind of environment.
Indeed, Dwayne, it's a very interesting topic, and you know, there's a lot of volatility in the subject matter. How did we go about designing the right experiment?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question because there's also the wrong way to do an experiment around this. And the kinds of ways that people typically do this is they just approach consumers and they ask them. They say, would you like to have ads in these kinds of environments? You know, do you think this environment is like unsuitable? And you know, do you think that a situation with guns and violence and drug use and sex, do you think this is unsuitable? And people will say, yes, that's very unsuitable. But of course, they're very eager to watch it. But if you ask them, they will tell you it's not suitable, that it's not suitable for ads. People have these opinions. And that's interesting, but it's not the way you want to measure for an effect. If you want to measure for an effect, you want to isolate the variable. You need a classic experimental design to really understand what you see in terms of impact. And so what we did is we took the classification scheme of that industry body, and we used it to classify content of Warner Brothers Discovery, of the client. And basically, we ended up with 3 little cells. In one cell, you had what we call low intensity, which is relatively safe. Then you had medium intensity, and then you had high intensity. And high intensity had very graphic sex, not like what you see on the internet. You know, we're not talking about extreme at that level, but what you see for television, certainly what the system would have classified as being unsafe. So you have sex, you have drug use, you have violence and guns. And so we wanted to see whether or not ads suffered when they were in that environment. You know, you could make an argument that maybe you would not see a lot of difference between those first 2 cells, so it may not be a perfectly linear relationship, but certainly if the assumption is true, you would see that 3rd cell get hammered when it was in that environment.
And is that what we saw?
So no, absolutely. If you look at this chart, what we see in this chart here is the results of the brand impact. And here you're looking at basically these 3 cells. That pink cell, the light pink cell, is actually the extreme cell. And whether you're talking about brand recall or purchase intent or any of the brand metrics that we ran, we saw absolutely no significant difference between any of those conditions. And this was also matched by the biometric data that we had as well. So you're not really seeing this kind of adverse effect at all. And so we have to say that assumption that the market has is actually, at least in the context of television, it's actually a flawed assumption.
So what are the implications of these findings, Dr. Varan?
Well, there's a lot there, really. Intuitively, it makes sense to say that unsafe spaces are not good. And to be clear, we're not arguing that there are not spaces that don't have adverse effects. We're not saying there's no such thing as unsafe content. What we are arguing, though, is that the schema is flawed. So if you think about this industry body schema, classification system, The question that I would raise is, what was the empirical evidence which guided that classification system? And my bet is that there was not any really good data that drove it. My bet is that that was driven because somebody sat down. And again, I don't know this. I have no idea how it is, but I would question what the empirical basis was, because certainly in our data, we saw no evidence that that kind of unsafe content was having that adverse effect. And this is very costly for publishers, right? To have your content classified as unsafe, that's very significant revenue loss that you're experiencing as a consequence. So the question is really, you would expect to see some empirical basis for it. Now, again, to be fair, there could be normative reasons why you would choose not to place ads in that environment. It could be that you don't want to support content that has, guns in it and sex in it. And, it could be that you feel that it might make the brand, look bad, although that's an empirical question that should get tested, right? It could be that there are political reasons for it. But if the assumption is that the ad suffers as a consequence, then you really need an empirical basis for the standard. So what should happen is there should be a very significant body of research that's done, empirical research of the type that we talked about today, that tests those different assumptions and then determines a classification. I'm sure there is content out there that is unsafe, but you want the empirical evidence guiding that decision, not somebody's normative values.
It makes a lot of sense indeed, Dr. Varan. So, the myth that advertisers shouldn't be investing in unsafe contexts, at least on television. Dr. Varan, what say you?
So again, just a little qualifier there. What we're saying is that based on the standard that is there today, which lacks, we believe, that kind of empirical evidence, because again, there may be unsafe content out there, but based on that classification scheme, busted.
Thank you again for joining us. My name is Philip Lomax, and this is Dr. Dwayne Varan, and we'll see you on our next episode.